Welcome back to Klepper's Corner, Today in History. Today we are looking at belief, conquest, invention, and the human habit of turning crisis into paperwork with a body count. Segment 1, and theology meets imperial management. In 325, Emperor Constantine I convened the First Council of Nicaea because Christianity was growing fast. The Roman Empire was trying to hold itself together, and several hundred bishops arguing over Christ was starting to look less like theology and more like a national security briefing. The dispute centered on Arianism, the teaching associated with Arius that Christ was not co-eternal with God the Father, which sounds abstract until you remember that in the 4th century, a theological adjective could get you exiled by an emperor who still had not technically been baptized. Constantine wanted unity, and like every executive in a meeting he only partly understands, he decided the answer was one Greek word and enough imperial pressure to make everyone agree. The council condemned Arianism, produced the Nicene Creed, and welded religious authority to state power for centuries. Later legend claims St. Nicholas of Myra got so enraged by Arius that he slapped or punched him, which historians doubt, but everyone wants to be true because it gives us Santa Claus as the patron saint of children and theological crowd control. Nicaea matters because it showed that belief was no longer just belief. It could become law, empire, identity, and enforcement. Constantine wanted spiritual consensus, but what he really launched was a recurring European software update. One faith, one state, endless patches, and a surprising number of people arguing violently over the terms of service. Segment 2, and castles, child kings, and bad royal reviews. In 1217, England was trapped in the First Barons' War, which is what happens when King John signs the Magna Carta, immediately tries to crawl out of it, dies of dysentery, and leaves a 9-year-old heir to clean up the royal customer feedback. The barons were so sick of John that they invited Prince Louis of France to take the English throne, because medieval politics sometimes looked like hiring a foreign contractor after your king flooded the constitutional basement. The defense of young Henry III fell to William Marshal, the aging knight and regent who somehow had the energy of both a grandfather and a siege engine. Lincoln Castle was held by Lady Nicola de la Haye, a woman in her 60s who had already survived one siege and treated invaders like raccoons in the attic, noisy, destructive, and not getting the house. Marshall led a relief force into Lincoln, using hidden access, crossbowmen, and street fighting to crush the French and rebel barons. The victory broke Prince Louis's campaign, secured Henry III's crown, and helped preserve the Magna Carta, when the Regency government reissued it to calm the defeated nobility. That is the strange genius of constitutional history. Sometimes liberty survives because exhausted rulers need a coupon to stop everyone from burning down the kingdom. Marshall reportedly charged forward so eagerly, his men had to remind the 70-year-old to put on his helmet, the medieval version of, "Sir, your seatbelt." Then the Royalists looted Lincoln after saving it, because even liberation came with a service fee. The battle saved a dynasty and showed that government occasionally depends on elderly people with swords making better decisions than everyone with a crown. Segment 3, and explorers, gifts, and global bad manners. On May 20th, 1498, Vasco da Gama reached the Malabar coast near Calicut, proving Europe could reach Asia by sailing around Africa. Portuguese rulers wanted spices and luxury goods without Arab and Venetian middlemen, because empires have always been gifted at turning a cheaper pepper bill into a moral mission. But the first meeting was not a triumph of diplomacy. Da Gama arrived before the Zamorin of Calicut with gifts like cloth, hats, coral, brass vessels, sugar, oil, and honey, which, in a wealthy Indian Ocean trading city, landed about as well as gas station flowers at a royal wedding. Local Muslim merchants immediately recognized the Portuguese as armed economic competition and pointed out the embarrassing lack of gold or silver. Relations collapsed fast. When the Zamorin expected customs duties, Da Gama answered with the imperial customer service strategy, kidnapping locals and sailing away angry. His voyage opened a direct sea route and helped launch centuries of European maritime dominance, trade disruption, and colonial violence. 8 years later, Christopher Columbus died in Valladolid, still insisting he had reached Asia, and still fighting over titles and money like a man trying to get a refund from the monarchy. Then his bones began a posthumous travel schedule so absurd it needed a luggage tag. Valladolid, Seville, Santo Domingo, Havana, back to Seville, while the Dominican Republic later claimed it still had some of him too. DNA testing supports the Seville remains, but the skeleton is incomplete, meaning Columbus may have achieved in death what he achieved in life, linking two hemispheres, confusing everyone, and leaving a custody dispute behind. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Homestead Act, opening vast western lands to settlers who could live on a plot, build a dwelling, cultivate it for 5 years, and pay a small fee. On paper, it was a radical democratization of property, giving poor families, immigrants, women, and freed people a path to land ownership. But on paper is doing heroic labor there, because the land being distributed had been taken from native nations through war, removal, broken treaties, and legal language polished until dispossession sounded like development. The Homestead Act created opportunity and tragedy in the same breath, like a brochure showing a happy cabin at sunset while leaving forced displacement just outside the frame. 11 years later, Jacob Davis and Levi Strauss received a patent for copper-riveted work pants, creating blue jeans as durable gear for miners and laborers whose pockets were losing a daily war against reality. The ultimate symbol of American cool began as reinforced workwear, designed by a Russian Jewish tailor and a Bavarian merchant for men digging in dirt. Then, in 1927, Charles Lindbergh took off in the spirit of St. Louis, with no radio, no parachute, no forward windshield, a wicker seat, sandwiches, and the kind of confidence that makes safety inspectors develop a facial twitch. 5 years later, Amelia Earhart chose the same date for her solo Atlantic crossing, battled ice, mechanical failures, and a leaking fuel line, then landed in an Irish pasture and casually explained she had come from America. These stories are progress in its most American outfit: land grants, blue jeans, and aircraft sold as destiny, while the fine print quietly asks, who is paying the real cost? May 20th also carries darker anniversaries. In 1940, the first official prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, but they were 30 German criminals transferred from Sachsenhausen to serve as capos, prisoner functionaries empowered by the SS to dominate the people who would arrive next. That detail matters because Auschwitz did not begin with the full industrial machinery of mass murder visible to the world. It began with administration, hierarchy, and a system designed to make cruelty flow downward while the state kept its hands organized on paper. A year later, Germany launched the airborne invasion of Crete, filling the sky with paratroopers and gliders in the first major airborne assault in history. The Germans captured the island, but the losses were so staggering that Hitler never again approved a large-scale airborne operation. It was a victory with its own warning label. And Cretan civilians refused to behave like scenery in someone else's war. They fought with old rifles, knives, farm tools, and whatever they could grab, treating elite paratroopers like an invasive species that had picked the wrong olive grove. In 1983, the Church Street bombing in Pretoria showed another grim face of resistance and repression, as the ANC's armed wing struck near South Africa's military apparatus during apartheid, killing military personnel and civilians and revealing how domination can push conflict into horrifying civilian space. And in 2002, East Timor became independent after Portuguese colonial rule, Indonesian invasion, and a 24-year occupation that killed an estimated quarter of its people. Its flag rose at midnight, not as a tidy ending, but as proof that survival can outlast empires, militias, and occupation paperwork. These anniversaries sit uncomfortably together because they should. They show systems built to control, people forced to resist, and dignity surviving in places power was certain it had finished the job. In conclusion, today's history gives us emperors managing doctrine, knights rescuing child kings, explorers arriving with bad gifts and worse intentions, governments selling opportunity on stolen ground, inventors dressing the working class, aviators gambling with the sky, and communities resisting machines built to crush them. Humanity does not learn neatly. It keeps making the same mess with newer tools, better branding, and more dramatic hats.